You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network, coming to you live today from your nation's capital in freezing cold Washington, D.C. Joining us now is one of my favorite guests because I learn so much every time he is on, Ambassador Patrick Theros, and he was the ambassador to the state of Qatar in 1995. And he's also served in just a wealth and variety of positions, including political advisor to the Commander-in-Chief of Central Command, Deputy Chief of Mission and Political Officer in Amman, Charge d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission in Abu Dhabi, Economic and Commercial Counselor in Damascus, and he has spent a career in the State Department. He also served as political advisor to the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Central Command, as well as earlier assignments in Saudi Arabia, Nicaragua, and Lebanon. So every time we get him on, his wealth of knowledge and experience is really honored to have him. Mr. Ambassador, great to have you, sir.
Good to be on, John. Enjoy it. Always enjoy this.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to talk about the ambassador, like you were, to Qatar. Right now we don't have one. Before the midterms, the State Department had nominated a career diplomat to take that position. Then that person was not renominated, as you know, when the new Congress came in. And then there was a report that former congressman of the 2nd District of Virginia, Scott Taylor, was personally selected by the president to be his nominee for ambassador to Qatar. Scott Taylor, a one-term congressman, defeated in November by Elaine Luria. Taylor, of course, the Republican, also former Navy SEAL, had served on the U.S. base in Qatar, has been there many times, knows the area, knows the Gulf. Seemed like a perfect fit for the administration's agenda and for Scott Taylor, and his experience and resume undisputed. But now we haven't heard anything, and there's no nomination, and everybody's trying to figure out what is going on and what is the level of dysfunction that's going on in the State Department where they can't even get him nominated.
That is a fascinating question. I mean, the American system for nominating ambassadors has always been, I was going to use a bad word, but it's always been a little bit confusing. Let me tell you the way it used to work. There is something in the White House called the Presidential Appointments Office. It gets a list of embassies that are coming open in the next year or so. Most, except the Bush 41 White House, at least in my career, except for that White House, most of the time it would begin with, do we have a political person who would like to be appointed to that embassy? And if they do, they send that back to the Department of State, say, do you have any objections to this guy? Most of the time, it'd have to be a pretty extremely bad case for the Department of State to say, no, we don't want him. I've seen that once in my career, only. And most of the time, then they go ahead and they nominate the political appointee. If they don't have a political appointee who wants that particular, an acceptable political appointee who wants that job, they then go to the Department of State. Department of State has an organization, a committee. It's called the D Committee. It's the deputies who have all the major bureaus who get together and say, okay, we picked John Smith or John Fredericks to be career officer. He's done this and that. He meets the qualifications from our point of view, and they send that name up to the White House.
Yes.
Again, 9 times out of 10, if there isn't a political appointee who wants the job, they say fine, and then you go through the process of vetting the candidate, doing everything that is necessary. And until now, people try to keep this as much a secret as possible. We do not like having the names of potential ambassadors circulating. One way to kill your nomination is to tell people that you've been nominated before the president actually signs the nomination letter. That is a complete no, that is a really great way to kill your nomination. At this point, all goes through. You get security clearance and so forth. Goes back up to the Presidential Appointments Office. They write the letter to the Senate, and then it goes to the Senate. That's the normal process. Every now and then, something will happen. For example, let's say somebody is going to Moscow, and then they decide they would rather send him to Berlin for something. They will withdraw the appointment and reappoint them to something else and send somebody else to Moscow. At this point, we have some very serious dysfunction in the Department of State and some very serious dysfunction in the White House Appointments Office. I understand that there has been huge turnover in the White House Appointments Office. Right. Also, I understand this turnover has led to a lack of an orderly process. In other words, it could well be that somebody wanted Mr. Taylor to get an ambassadorial position. They asked him, all this without telling the Appointments Office. They asked him, he said yes, and then the person who wanted to get his name on the list didn't know how to do it. And then they went to the Appointments Office. The Appointments Office said, we've already moved somebody else's name. And then when that person didn't get through the Senate before the end of the session, the Appointments Office decided to drop the previous nominee and appoint Mr. Taylor. However, one thing, if Taylor has not been formally nominated and the story is out as to who he is, that is actually a very serious breach of the way the system is supposed to operate. And if I know of several cases in my own experience where a name got out before it was formally approved and sent forward by the president, and the Appointments Office or state or somebody came back and said, can't do it. So one of the problems with Mr. Taylor today may be that his name got out. It should not, there are rumors, but it should not get out before. And one other important thing happens before the Senate nomination goes forward. Once they've done the background, they have vetted it, and the Appointments Office said, this is the guy. They send it back up to the President's office. The President says, yeah, that's the guy I want. Then you send a letter to the country involved. It's called an agrément letter in French, which means this is the person we want to send to your country to be ambassador. This is your one chance to say you find him unacceptable. And the country has the right to come back and say, yep, guy's fine, go ahead, process him, and we'll be happy to hear from him. Or we don't like him. Or sometimes, and this happens particularly in the United States because we are the superpower and no one really wants to be in a position of refusing agreement, they stall. And I've seen that happen a couple of times where there was somebody nominated to an important post in the Middle East. The country clearly did not want him. In this case, it's no longer a secret. The Saudis do not want us to send career diplomats to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis only want political appointees. We sent an agreement letter, agrément, to the Saudi government saying that we have selected this person to be ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He was a career officer, and the Saudis sat on it. And they sat on it for a couple of months, if I remember correctly. It's been some years now. And then informally, they told us, please don't send us agrément. We don't want to be in a position of saying no, but please don't send us agrément requests for career officers. We only want political appointees. And that killed it. They pulled it back, and then they sent a political appointee. And since then, we've only sent political appointees to Riyadh, to Saudi Arabia. So my guess right now, and this is purely a guess,
yes,
is that leaking Mr. Taylor's name may have harmed his nomination process. The other problem that we have, of course, is that both state is understaffed. Too many people left the State Department, too many senior knowledgeable people and eligible people left the State Department under Mr. Tillerson's tenure. So they're having a real problem finding qualified people to be ambassadors to whatever country is involved, because you're competing. Other important jobs also need these people. And as I say, there's been such a turnover in the White House presidential appointment staff that it's really hard to figure out who's in charge of what's going on right now. That is a really long, much longer answer than I planned, but that, I think, is the short version.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, very accurate, though, because you look at some of these appointments and nobody can figure out, is it coming from White House personnel? Is it coming from the State Department? Is it coming from Secretary of State Pompeo? Is it a combination? And this kind of thing only comes to light because the name of Scott Taylor, who's high profile, gets leaked. And to those it was leaked to, saw it in the news, and they're like, well, that makes sense. He certainly got the experience on the resume. Yeah. And then nothing happens, and you see the list of nominees that came out with a new Congress, and his name's not on it, nor is the name of the career diplomat that was originally nominated that had to get renominated because the person didn't get confirmed when the new Congress came in. So now it's in limbo, and nobody knows anything, and you can't get the information. You know, it's interesting when you talk about Secretary Tillerson, many people say that when he came in it was a disaster, not necessarily his policies, but I've heard a lot of people tell me off the record that, you know, when he came in, he downsized the department where it really hurt them, and he was trying to run it like he ran Exxon. Is that an accurate statement?
That is pretty much my understanding. I mean, that's what I saw. I think Secretary Tillerson was, on the policy side, very smart, very competent, knew what he was doing, and had all the right instincts. For example, he headed off that brief moment of insanity when the president joined up with Saudi Arabia and the UAE to condemn the Qataris. But the problem was, is that he was essentially a guy who had worked for Exxon for 40 years. Then he was very good at what he did. But I don't think he actually made the mental transition that he's no longer the head of a profit-making oil company whose ultimate objective is to make as much money as possible for the shareholders, and now the head of a department that actually doesn't have a profit margin. You can't, what is the end game for the Department of State? The end game is preserving the peace, preserving the interests of the United States, or advocating the interests of the United States. You can't quantify that. So to the outsider, it looks like, wow, they got an awful lot of extra people running around that we don't need. In fact, you can't quantify it. Yeah, there are places in the Department of State. I mean, but those who were inside of us always thought that there were things that we could do to improve efficiency or lower costs or get more out of the people we were on. But at the other end of it, you can't set a profit margin. There isn't a profit. And for somebody who's been in the private sector their entire life, that is probably the biggest problem with businessmen bringing business practices. Business practices, when you're trying to increase efficiency and get better use out of your people, are fine. Business practices, when you're just trying to reduce costs without thinking of the end game, without thinking of what is the output of that branch of government, always turns out badly.
Well, I think you kind of summed it up, and it seems like the State Department is still digging out under some of the decisions that Secretary Tillerson made. Since Secretary Pompeo has been there, I assume, being in Congress, leading the CIA, is he trying to bring it back to a state of normalcy, staff it up so that we can get things done, or is he still suffering from the damage that was done by Secretary Tillerson?
Well, the damage is very difficult to undo. One is too many senior and upper middle and too many senior people left. 600 people left. Most of them went on and took early retirement. A few people resigned before taking retirement, but that number was relatively small. But too many people left and take retirement. When you take retirement, there's a function of the law that comes in. Let's say in my case, I retired, 20 years ago. I can be appointed to a political position, and then essentially my retirement pay, my total pay cannot exceed the higher of whatever pay. In other words, if my retirement package is more than the job I'm being a political job, then I can only take my retirement. I can only be paid up to my retirement. If my political job salary is higher than my retirement, then I can only be paid up to the amount of the salary.
Right.
But the other problem is, for non-political jobs, there's something called when actually employed, WAE, which limits the amount of hours I can spend in a non-political job if I'm called back to the Department of State. I have to be called back to a position that is either a Schedule C or a political appointment. I can't be called in and assigned to a job that was a regular State Department job, say a Deputy Assistant Secretary or an Office Director.
Right.
Because I'm limited in the number of hours I can actually do that.
Right. So basically, the 600 senior people in the State Department, many of whom just left or were forced to leave, took retirement. Now, in reality, they can't come back. There's no incentive for them to come back because they can't make any more money than they're making under their retirement plan and whatever else they have.
Yeah.
So they're just not going to come back because basically you'd be working for free. You're not going to do that. Nobody's going to do that.
Right.
So they're gone, and now they have a dearth of experience. So that kind of explains the largesse that's going on in getting these nominees through, because there's still so many openings of ambassadorships all over the place. 2 years plus now into the President Trump's administration. So let's get back to Scott Taylor. So on paper, Taylor, perfect candidate. Been there, done that, knows the area, has been to Qatar many times, served on our U.S. base there, and has the congressional experience, Navy SEAL, fits it to a T. Somebody leaks it. So Taylor, a good choice there. How do you get him through? What happens now? Because it seems like he would be eventual nomination would be in the best interest of the United States.
I think the way it'll work out is if Taylor leaked it, he's dead. If they find out that Taylor was the guy who went out and told his friends that he leaked, that he had been selected, he's dead. If they can prove that somebody leaked it, somebody unrelated to Taylor, if they can show somebody unrelated to Taylor leaked it either out of malice or out of stupidity, then I think they can proceed with they will proceed with the nomination. What you're probably looking at now is people going back and saying, how the hell did this name get out? Yeah,
I mean, what was interesting is it got leaked, and I remember reading it somewhere. It got leaked. Somebody sent it to me. And then, like, either the same day or the next day, the New York Times said, no, that's not true. They refuted the story by another reporter, which I thought was totally bizarre. Like, there was a leak, and then the leak was taken back by another outlet. I think it was Maggie Haberman of the New York Times, if memory serves me, said, no, that's not what I heard. So it's like we have a leak and then an anti-leak.
Yeah.
What the hell?
Well, and there's probably a lot going on behind the scenes right now with limited staff and limited expertise while people try to sort this out.
Right.
So I'll give an example. In one case I was involved in, I was actually at Post, and there was somebody who wanted the job, a political appointee, who was pretty bad. He was so bad, in fact, that the State Department got up its courage to say this guy's totally unacceptable. But he had enough political clout that he could prevent anybody else from coming forward. So he actually hung on to the job for he stopped the process for 14 months.
Wow.
And a lot of it is maybe I'll give you a wild-eyed guess. Maybe some other political appointee wants the job. He leaked it, tried to kill Taylor's nomination, and is one of those people who is strong enough to prevent someone else from getting it, but not strong enough to get himself on the list. I've actually seen that happen.
Well, you've been here a long time, Mr. Ambassador. You've seen it all. So, in your experience with the Gulf, and you've served there for so long, in your judgment, based on your experience, do you think that the eventual nomination of Scott Taylor to Ambassador of Qatar, do you think that would be a good choice for the United States?
I was a career officer, so we always, we're a little unhappy with having too many political appointees. But there's good political appointees and there are bad ones. If you just look at the background of Mr. Taylor, I would say, one, he knows the area, but more importantly, he's from inside the system. He was in the Navy for a long time. Naval officers, their experience tends to push them to be relatively good political appointees because they know how the system works. They know how important it is to maintain good morale at posts. One of the problems I hate to say this, but some of the worst political appointees are ex-senators, because senators don't know how important it is to maintain good morale at post. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the key jobs of an ambassador. He's got to keep his troops happy because they're the ones who do most of the work for him.
Interesting.
So the fact that he was in the Navy, the fact that he served in Congress and has political experience, that he knows the region, would, on paper at least, make Mr. Taylor a good candidate for a political appointment as ambassador to Qatar.
All right, that is a very astute analysis by former ambassador of Qatar and longtime State Department career Foreign Service diplomat, Ambassador Andrew Theros. Ambassador, thank you so much for that explanation, and sir, it's always
okay,
my honor
John,
to have
it's
you
fun.
on.
Enjoy being it.